So, the first thing I want to start with is a bit of a primer on this concept of the burden of proof, which I expect that some of you will have heard of before. So, broadly, the idea of the burden of proof is working out whose job it is to prove the claim that's at issue. So, anytime that we've got a debate about whether some proposition is true, it seems like one side is going to be saying, yes, it is true, and another side is going to be saying, no, it isn't true. And the question is, whose responsibility is it to prove that case? So one of them will be the default assumption, and the burden of proof will fall on the other side to then prove to everybody that their position is correct. So in this case, thinking about this question of whether there's life after death, it's either for the defender of the afterlife to prove that the afterlife exists, or it's for the afterlife skeptic to prove that the afterlife doesn't exist. So, which of these options is it going to be? So, thinking about the burden of proof generally, one of the things that it's going to depend on is thinking about our background assumptions about the way that the world works. So, consider the example that um, we might think of about the question, do witches exist? So, on the one hand, we might have the person who is skeptical about the existence of witches, and on the other hand, we might have somebody who thinks that witches genuinely exist. So, who bears the burden of proof to say to prove their case? In this case, I think that the witches skeptic, sorry, the defender of witches bears the burden of proof. So, somebody who thinks that witches exist, it's on them to show us that witches do exist, because our default assumption as a society in the present day is going to be that witches don't exist. And so it seems like it's only fair to expect the person who's making the extraordinary claim, the one that goes against the default assumptions of society, to be the one who has to go and find the evidence to prove it. It doesn't seem fair, by contrast, to say that the person who says that there are no witches has to go and prove that there are no witches. As a general rule, the burden of proof will often be on the person who's suggesting that um, claiming that something does exist rather than something doesn't exist, because as a general rule, it's very difficult to prove that something doesn't exist. Um, so on the other hand, we might consider the case of gravity. So if we're thinking about whether gravity exists, um, is it on the person who's defending the existence of gravity to prove that gravity exists, or is it on the person who's saying that gravity doesn't exist to prove that it doesn't? So in this case, I think that the burden of proof falls on the gravity skeptic. So um, we live in a world where gravity forms a lot of causal explanation. Gravity is the default accepted physical theory about how the world works, at least in large part. Um, so, given that gravity has all this excellent predictive power and seems to be doing a great job of explaining how the physical world works, it seems like if somebody wants to deny that gravity exists, they're going to have to be the one who bears the burden of proof. Because, again, they're the one who's making the extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary arguments. So, now that we have this background understanding of what the burden of proof is, where does the burden of proof lie in this question? Whose job is it to prove the claim? So, thinking about this question, I think that the burden of proof falls on the person who wants to say that the afterlife exists. Why is this the case? So, this is because of a background assumption that a lot of us work under, which is this assumption of naturalism. So, naturalism is a really broad philosophical concept, um, and it's been interpreted by lots of people as meaning lots of different things. But the broad idea, at least for our purposes, is that all things which exist in the world exist naturally. And this is kind of the idea that it is congruent with science. So science posits that all the things that exist naturally. So if there's anything supernatural like the afterlife, this seems like it's going to be going against the kind of general understanding that we have of how the world works in its totality. So if we're positing something that goes against this kind of naturalist background, then that's going to be the side that bears the burden of proof. So this is going to be relevant to your essays because it seems like we're going to be able to start with the assumption that um, there is no afterlife, and it's on the person who's saying there is an afterlife to go and prove that claim. And that's going to be, the default state of play for um, this question. So hopefully that's useful for you in terms of where to start from in your understandings.